A question I see a lot is, should I go out and buy a bivvy bag, a tent or a hammock? Which is best for bike packing? I did a video on this a couple of years ago now where I ran through the pros and cons of each of them in just a little bit of detail. But in this video, I'm going to be talking about the bivvy bag. Let's first touch on some of the more obvious pros and cons of a bivvy bag. I first came to bikepacking from a road cycling background, so for me it was all about going as fast as possible, carrying as minimal amount of stuff as possible, and that's how I came across the bivvy bag. That's kind of what it excels at. Some more pretty obvious pros of a sleeping bag is that it's very cheap. Out of the three options, this is by far and away the cheapest accommodation that you can buy. Tents, especially high quality bikepacking tents, tend to be very expensive, several £100s, whereas a bivvy bag you can pick up one for maybe 30 quid, 50 quid, and it'll last you a lifetime. A second pretty obvious point is discretion. This is a really good option if you wanted to do stealth camping, wild camping, where you're not really supposed to be. It's very easy to set up, no one's going to notice you there, especially if you go for a green colour like mine. A really good option if you don't want to pay for campsites. Another really cool thing about a bivvy bag is you are open to the elements, which of course is good and bad. But one really cool thing is if you're setting up the bivvy bag, you can probably hear all the sounds of nature, see what's going on, look up at the stars, which isn't something you can do once you're inside a tent. Some of the more obvious cons, as I mentioned, you are quite exposed, so if it rains and you haven't got any other form of protection, you are going to get wet. I don't care what anyone says, you will get wet if you're in a bivvy bag. The best thing that you can do to combat this is to take a tarp, so if you're camping in the woods, you can set up a bit of a cover. But when you factor in the fact that you're going to have to take some guy lines, fasten that down, maybe some pegs, maybe some poles if you wanted to do it that way, it can start to get just about as heavy as a tent, which kind of defeats the point of it being a lightweight, sleek setup. Now obviously if you stumble across a little bivvy like this or a makeshift shelter, you might be absolutely fine. But unless it's really nice sunny days, going in a bivvy bag will pose the risk of you getting wet unless you're prepared. Let's talk about insects. It's not something I've had a huge amount of trouble with. However, when I did go bikepacking on the Isle of Skye, I had to bring a midge net with me. Even so, the midges found a way of getting into my bivvy bag and I got absolutely torn to shreds. You will find that insects will come for your face in a bivvy bag unless you've got some sort of covering, so you need to think about that. You do hear awful stories of people who've woken up with like snails and slugs on their face. That's never happened to me, but you just have to be aware of that. Now, if you watched that first video where I compared the three shelters, you'll have seen that I mentioned hooped bivvies, and these are basically a bivvy bag with a hood that allows you to be protected from the elements and stops that issue we've just talked about. I had a bit of a strong opinion on them back then. I thought they were a load of rubbish, because why would you want something so restrictive yet covering your face? It doesn't really make much difference. You might as well just buy a tent, which has way more pros to it. But I've actually kind of changed my mind on that a little bit. If you're wanting to be really discreet, yet also protected from the elements, and you don't have to think about any other additional gear like a tarp, you just want to keep things simple, then actually I can kind of see the point of those. However, those hooped bivvies can be a fair bit more expensive because there's actually a bit of a pole structure in there or something else keeping the hood from hitting your face, and as a result, more material, more time manufacturing it, it just tends to cost a little bit more. And the other pretty obvious one, if you've ever been in a bivvy bag, is they are very restrictive. Once you're in, you're in. It's quite difficult to get in and out. It's quite difficult to set up your sleeping bag and your sleeping mat inside. Once you've done it, you're fine. But then if you have to get up in the middle of the night or make some adjustments, it can be a bit of a pain. Unlike a tent where you can sit up and get things sorted, get back into your sleeping bag, once you've taken the sleeping bag out, or once you've got out, you do have to readjust everything again. And because you have to have your hands in there as well, you can't exactly reach for things easily. You have to worm your way out to be able to do it. So quite restrictive. I want to talk about some less obvious pros and cons. Until you've actually owned a bivvy bag, you might not know about these. One pro to think about is that it can kind of act as an additional layer. Even if you've got a tent or a hammock, taking a bivvy bag with you, you can put on the outside of your sleeping bag. It adds that additional layer, like I mentioned. It also can potentially stop water from getting in. So if you've got water seeping in through the bottom of your tent, or if you're in a hammock and it starts to rain, you're not going to get wet. So there's that additional bonus you might not have thought of. So even if you haven't got a bivvy bag, but you've been thinking about it, that might give you enough ammunition to go out and buy one. Another con you've probably not thought about unless you've actually owned a bivvy bag is that you were pretty much guaranteed to get wet in one way or the other. And hear me out when I say this. If you get heavy rain, you're going to get rained in from the top, and you may also find, depending on how good quality your bivvy bag is, that water can still seep in. But the more common issue is that you're going to get wet from the inside. If you've got a really good bivvy bag, it might not happen to you, but most bivvy bags aren't particularly breathable. You might find that your condensation coming from your body ends up being stuck inside that bivvy bag, and it can make your sleeping bag wet. This is especially bad if you've got a down sleeping bag. It starts to affect the performance of the sleeping bag, and it can be quite uncomfortable. Another thing you might not have thought about, and also might not be relevant to you, is that you have no privacy in a bivvy bag. Everything's on show, everyone can see you. Whereas if you're in a tent, you can obviously zip up the door, you've got a bit of your own private space there. That doesn't happen with a bivvy bag. Now, if you're doing stealth camping, you're probably not going to be bothered about that. But there are occasions, like if you wanted to go for a campsite, for example, where you're just going to look a bit of an idiot. Whereas if you're in a tent, at least you've got that bit of privacy, even if it's a tiny one. Something I've touched on before but want to re-emphasise is that it's not easy to get in and out of a bivvy bag comfortably. Because there's a few layers to it, it does take a bit of faffing about to get comfortable. Getting in your sleeping bag, putting your sleeping mat in if you're going to do that, laying on it, making sure you're in the right position, pulling everything up while you're sort of laying down to stop you from getting wet. And then in the night, if you're like me, you roll about a lot, you can find you end up working your way out of a bivvy bag, which isn't ideal. So let me tell you who should be buying a bivvy bag. Someone who does bikepacking races or is an Audaxer, and all you're bothered about is covering huge mileage. You don't want to take lots of stuff with you. You might only be having a couple of hours sleep at a time. This is ideal for you. The second is someone who is on a proper budget, i.e. you do not want to spend more than 100 quid for your whole setup. Then you're probably going to have to go for a bivvy bag. A tent's going to be out of your budget. Number 3 is for someone who is planning on doing mostly wild camping, probably in countries where it's illegal, like here in England. The great thing about a bivvy bag we've touched on already is that it's really discreet. So if you're just wanting to set up, have a few hours sleep, and then carry on early the next morning, not have to pay for a campsite, this is the go-to option. Any tent is going to be visible at some point if you're wild camping, and a hammock isn't ideal unless you've got places to attach it to. This would be what I would be going for. Number 4 is someone who's going to be going to mostly hot and dry countries for bikepacking. I mentioned that you're going to get wet in a bivvy bag at some point anyway, but if it's hot and dry, you're not going to have much condensation from the outside, so you're not going to get wet that way. And because it's warm, you don't need to be wrapped up super tight. You can undo things a little bit and still be fairly comfortable. And the only other person who should be buying one is someone who wants to integrate it into their kit that they've got already as a way of bolstering their kit to make it more comfortable, or just to have that option if they want to do a bit of stealth wild camping. Everybody else, though, is better off getting a tent. Much more comfortable, easy to set up, you can still wild camp in it, albeit maybe not as discreetly, you just have to be a bit more on it with getting up and leaving early. And you can use a campsite with it without looking like a tit, like you do in a bivvy bag. You also have the option of sharing with others. If you're going bikepacking with your other half or a family, you can get big tents where you can store all your stuff inside, all sleep together safely rather than having individual bivvy bags. And that is kind of the reason I've made a switch to a tent. I like to be able to use campsites. I like the fact I can store stuff inside, and I've got multiple options now. If I want to go bikepacking with my children or my family, I've got bigger tents to allow me to do that. So that's it, that's the truth about bivvy bags. Let me know which method of camping you prefer, bivvy bag, tent or hammock, and why. Let me know any questions in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.